Ladies and gentlemen, it's great that today is Farmers' Day, and we have excellent panel today. Left on the table, there is Alberto Saldamando from Indigenous Environmental Network from the United States. Then near him, there is Simone Oliveira, Executive Director of the Global Forest Coalition from Paraguay. My name is Andrei Lalitin. I am chair of Russian NGO Friends of Siberian Forests, and also I am membership coordinator for the Global Forest Coalition. To the right for me, it is Jennifer Ameja from NAPE, Friends of the Earth, Uganda. Then there is Cynthia Wechabe from Indigenous Environmental Network from Kenya, and also her colleague Nayan Jibet. And we are waiting from also one panelist, Yvonne Ramos from Ecuador. So I think we may start, and first I will give a floor to Alberto. Please.
Thank you very much. As protocol demands, I really want to thank the Izmir people for welcoming us to their lands. It's been a very warm welcome, and we very much appreciate it. The topic I've been asked to talk on is on the civil aviation. What is it? The civil aviation organizations plan to reduce offset their carbon emissions. It was estimated in 2013 that the civil aviation industry emitted 490.4 million tons of carbon. By 2020, the figure is likely to be and estimated that by 2020, the figure would likely be 50 million tons. But they had, by 2016, they had already reached the emissions level of 781 million tons of CO2. By 2035, the Stockholm Environmental Institute predicts that flying will be responsible for somewhere between 1.2 and 1.4 billion tons of carbon emissions. As you may know, the aviation is exempt from the FCCC, and so there is no way of controlling those emissions through the Framework Convention on Climate Change. These are very serious emissions. So the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, is meeting today in Montreal to try and agree as to how to offset those carbon emissions, 1.2 to 1.4 billion tons of carbon that are unaccounted for under the FCCC. Our concern is that, like in many other carbon trading schemes, the Clean Development Mechanism, for example, they not only did not contribute to the curtailing of emissions, but carbon offsets, in spite of carbon offsets, the European Union emissions went up by about 9%, I think was. I stand to be corrected, and I'm happy to be corrected. So how do we deal with these? What our concern is really that kind of, if the carbon market right now is failing at $5 a ton, this kind of input of billions of tons would create billions of dollars for carbon offsets, and we're afraid that they would be directed to our forests. The issue with forests and REDDs is one of control. The Indigenous Caucus this weekend reinforced their position that carbon markets offsets should not be allowed. There is a position of the caucus that's longstanding against carbon markets, precisely because the markets distort indigenous ownership of their land. Of the examples that are given to us of successful or semi-successful REDDs programs are all public money. They're all, at this point, grants from Norway and other Europeans that are directly working with indigenous peoples. They've obviously had many problems. One is really tenure and ownership of land. The states are now developing systems to avoid indigenous people's ownership of land. In fact, the REDD programs have delayed in Acre and in Brazil and other places the titling of land. So even if land is demarcated, the state, by the creation of conservation areas and protected areas, keeps the ownership of land and can develop and use it to their will, avoiding safeguards. That is basic. Without indigenous ownership of land, REDD is bound to fail because it steals control, and through the market system, it's the investor that owns the trees and not indigenous peoples. I think there may be other perspectives on these particular issues with regard to REDD Plus that are of some concern. Who owns the trees? And who has control over the trees? And indigenous peoples' denial of their own livelihoods, of their cultures, of the practice of their culture, their traditional medicines, their very identities is very much tied up with the production of means of subsistence. Their means of subsistence is also affected by restrictions on forest use and these modern forest management. In fact, the Green Carbon Fund had a proposal by Peru on the REDD program. They granted it without realizing that the organization that had given consent was not in the indigenous peoples concerned, but a gango created by the state of Peru to give that consent, or was responsible for securing that consent. So IDESEP and others wrote a letter to the Green Climate Fund pointing out that this was not their vision. Because in addition to not receiving the consent, Peru also developed a new, what they call a new paradigm of forest development, which is developing non-forest dependent industries. So like we'd be talking about monoculture plantation. Their REDD program allowed monoculture plantation of nuts, of other food products. It allowed cattle farming. It allowed all kinds of what they call non-forest dependent industries, including the building of roads, which will only attract invasion of poor landless people into indigenous lands. In any event, with this kind of money that perhaps is going to be impacted by the aviation offsets, there's also a great concern that there's an imbalance of power. An indigenous community in the forest does not have the economic power of the aviation industry by any means. And that imbalance, this complete imbalance of economic power really has indigenous peoples at a gross disadvantage. When we talk about REDD, when people talk about REDD, when the Norwegian government talks about REDD, they don't talk about the corruption. They don't talk about the illegal logging. They don't talk about the expansion of private cattle farming and other interest, soya, palm oil into indigenous lands. That's why I think there's a great concern that when you start creating markets with this kind of a volume, with this kind of a imbalance of economic power, indigenous people's forests are really at a disadvantage. Their interest, the maintenance of culture, their maintenance of their own lifeways, their own cosmovisions is going to be severely affected. In fact, is many times now affected by REDD programs and by carbon sequestration schemes of the forest, where they're denied control, where they're denied even use, where they're denied the continuation of the culture. So that's one thing to watch out for. The European Union has as yet not included forest offsets in their carbon trading schemes, even though it's a large market. The market hasn't worked. The price is too low. There's a glut of credits. But if the European Union decides that they are going to use these aviation credits, then I think indigenous forests are up for grabs. In the interest of time, I'll leave it there, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Alberta. We shall give possibility to all panelists first to speak, and then we shall they will answer your questions. And now I will give a floor to Yvonne Ramos from Ecuador. She will speak in Spanish with parallel translations, thanks to Simone.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Gracias. Mi nombre, como me ha presentado, muchas gracias, Simone Ramos. Yo soy de una organización ecológica en Ecuador que tiene ya 30 años de existencia.
My name is Yvonne Ramos. I come from an environmental organization in Ecuador that is already 30 years old.
Y formamos parte de una articulación nacional de mujeres defensoras de la naturaleza que se llama Saramanta Warmicuna.
And we're part of a national mobilization network of women that is called Saramanta Warmicuna.
Y ahora estamos aquí en Marrakech como parte también y en conjunto con 5 países, mujeres indígenas que han hecho estudios y tienen propuestas relacionadas con el tema del cambio climático, soluciones y problemas al respecto.
And we're here with a delegation of representatives of 5 indigenous nations, women from 5 indigenous nations that have developed concrete proposals to combat climate change.
Y perdone que sea así tan abusiva. Arranco haciendo una invitación. El día lunes de 9 a 10:30 tenemos un side event en el salón Borliux, ¿cómo se llama ese? El salón Borliux o algo así, por aquí mismo, aquí en la sala, en la zona verde.
So, and we will not have enough time to present all the 5 proposals here, but there's another side event on Monday from 9 to 10:30 in the Salon Borliux, which is somewhere here. Please look out for it, and there the proposals will be presented.
Dicho esto, y gracias por la oportunidad, entro al tema. Bien, para nosotros el problema principal del cambio climático tiene que ver con la situación del consumo y la quema de combustibles fósiles.
For us, the key problem in climate change is really the consumption and burning of fossil fuels.
Y en las discusiones últimas en relación al problema se ha ido desviando la atención a la discusión sobre el tema del carbono, descuidando la razón fundamental del problema.
We see that, you know, in the recent discussion, there's been a distraction from the central themes, and they're now talking about all kinds of carbon solutions and not focusing on fossil fuels anymore.
En el Ecuador, las discusiones y propuestas se han concentrado fundamentalmente en la propuesta de mantener el petróleo debajo de la tierra, y esta iniciativa se discutió mucho e inclusive se hizo pública a nivel internacional al proponer, por ejemplo, que en el Parque Nacional Yasuní se mantuviera el petróleo debajo de la tierra.
In Ecuador, there's been a lot of discussion about a proposal to just keep fossil fuels under the ground, and very concretely, they've been trying to keep the oil in the precious Yasuní Park under the ground.
Pero esta propuesta no es un invento de los ecologistas. Realmente quienes han sostenido en una lucha permanente de décadas y décadas en nuestro país y en muchos otros países han sido los pueblos originarios que han logrado detener proyectos extractivos de petróleo y de minería en muchas partes del mundo.
But please note that this is not a proposal that was originated by the ecological movements. It was the indigenous peoples that have led the fight against mining and oil exploration in Ecuador. And already for many years, they've been resisting projects in the tropical forests, and they've had quite a number of successes.
Y nuestra propuesta es que volvamos a mirar, digamos, como sociedad civil y como gobiernos, las posibilidades de retomar esta discusión y buscar las soluciones en la causa del problema real.
And the proposal is that as a civil society, we really build on these proposals and try to look to, tackle the root of the problem, that is how to leave oil in the soil.
En relación al tema que se está tratando aquí, respecto al tema de las soluciones, como por ejemplo la monocultura de plantaciones, nosotros hemos estudiado el caso que se refirió en 1993 en Ecuador, por ejemplo, cuando empresas holandesas propusieron un proyecto de plantaciones para absorción de carbono.
So, regarding this whole issue about, carbon offset and corporate-driven solutions, we have in Ecuador already experienced with forced carbon offsets that were actually promoting monoculture tree plantations to offset emissions by Dutch energy companies for more than 15 years.
Identificamos entonces que la modalidad desde esa época, para poder concretar, digamos, esta negociación, las empresas necesitan definitivamente firmar convenios y acuerdos que comprometen a las comunidades locales a destinar parte de su territorio para la ocupación de esos espacios que son muchas veces zonas agrícolas o zonas de conservación de alta biodiversidad, destinarlas a la aplicación de esas plantaciones.
And in the essence of these kinds of carbon offsets contracts, there are contracts drafted between the companies that do the trade and local communities, in which the local communities are obliged to destine part of their agriculture and other lands to, for example, the development of monoculture tree plantations.
Esos proyectos desde entonces hasta la fecha se han sido vendidos como soluciones para sacar de la pobreza a las comunidades más deprimidas en el país, por ejemplo.
And these proposals are being promoted with the discourse that this will reduce the poverty among some of the most impoverished communities in the country.
Sin embargo, los impactos que nosotros identificamos fueron muy graves porque las comunidades locales dejaron de ocupar sus propios territorios que eran usados para la subsistencia, para agricultura, para ganadería y destinarlos a plantaciones. Asimismo, áreas de altísima conservación de fuentes de agua y de biodiversidad fueron destruidas con la finalidad de colocar esas plantaciones.
But what we've actually seen is that through these contracts, communities were incentivized to give up their agriculture practices, to basically set aside their lands for these monoculture tree plantations. And with that, also some of the original ecosystems like paramos that contain a tremendous amount of water that are very important for the hydrological circle were also destroyed by pine plantations.
De esa manera, entonces, las personas de las comunidades tuvieron que abandonar sus territorios, salir a trabajar fuera de sus territorios y poder de esta forma subsistir con recursos que usaban ellos de otras actividades económicas.
And because there was no activity delivered by the pine plantation, these people were then incentivized to basically leave their lands, to go to the cities, to take up other jobs, and to basically just take another livelihood.
De esa manera, entonces, las poblaciones más pobres, digamos, las poblaciones que menos recurso económico tenían, acabaron al cabo de 20 o 30 años subsidiando con su propio trabajo y además con sus propios recursos de supervivencia como el territorio a grandes empresas holandesas que generaban emisiones de carbono.
And it actually boiled down to a subsidy on behalf of these communities that had to invest a tremendous amount of time and their lands, and then basically leave their lands aside just to offset the emissions and play into the profits of the number of big energy corporations in the Netherlands.
Yo creo que ese es un ejemplo que nos deja ver con claridad cuáles son esencialmente los principios fundamentales de propuestas que son, digamos, como estas de ocupar plantaciones para venta de carbono, en donde los ejes fundamentales, digamos, que es la tenencia del territorio, las actividades económicas y la conservación entran en contradicción con las propuestas con las que se venden estas iniciativas. En general.
And you can just see with these kinds of proposals how much contradictions there really are between the livelihoods of people and, so-called environmental aims and really the conservation of precious ecosystems.
Y en Ecuador tenemos entonces también otro ejemplo que me parece súper importante de colocarlo aquí, bajo el concepto o la propuesta de conservación, entre comillas, que en el Ecuador se implementa desde el Estado, que se llama sociobosque y sociopáramo.
And another very important proposal that has been pushed by the Ecuadorian government is sociobosque and sociopáramo.
Esta es entonces una propuesta desde el Estado de dar incentivos económicos a las comunidades locales para que hagan conservación.
This is to give incentives to local communities to conserve forest or other ecosystems.
Para este efecto, a mí me parece que un tema fundamental que no se discute, digamos, y que debería ser el punto de partida de discusión es el tema de, uno, el territorio, y dos, el gobierno sobre el territorio.
But the two key things that are not being discussed in these kinds of proposals are, first of all, the governance of the territories and
Gobierno.
gobiernos y
O sea, las comunidades.
The tenure of the territory and the governance of the territory.
Ajá. Porque en el Ecuador, con quien más se negocia ese tema es con las comunidades indígenas, que son las que más amplias extensiones territoriales conservadas tienen.
Because in Ecuador, the largest amount of forest is in hands of indigenous peoples.
Y en este caso de conservación, como en el de plantaciones, en el caso de plantaciones, la herramienta, el instrumento para comprometer a la gente es el uso de los contratos y los convenios.
And the key instrument really for these kinds of payment for environmental services systems is the specific contract that is made with the local communities and indigenous peoples on the ground.
En el caso de sociobosque, por ejemplo, tienen que hacer contratos que van de 20 años a 40 años.
And in sociobosque, for example, these contracts are between 20 and 40 years.
En los cuales tenemos dos contratantes, Ministerio de Ambiente y comunidades locales.
And it's a direct contract between the ministry and local communities.
Las comunidades locales tienen que comprometerse a muchísimas cosas para efectos de garantizar la conservación.
The local communities are being obliged through these contracts to take up a very large amount of legal commitments regarding the ecosystem they live in.
Mientras tanto, el Estado no hace ningún tipo de compromiso de conservación, como por ejemplo, no introducir actividades extractivas petroleras o mineras en esos territorios.
But what's typical is that the government itself is not taking up similar commitments, for example, in trying to reduce mining and oil exploration in tropical forests.
Esto ha generado una gran conflictividad social en los territorios donde intervienen sociobosque y sociopáramo, porque los líderes que en tiempo atrás tenían posiciones de defensa territorial y sostenimiento de evitar que se introduzcan actividades mineras o petroleras, finalmente en algunos casos terminaron aceptando la introducción de las actividades extractivas.
And this has actually created quite some conflicts on the ground, because in some of the indigenous and other communities, some of the leaders used to be key in the resistance against oil and mining projects in their area, but now because of the sociobosque scheme, they're being convinced to give up that resistance and just accept the funding for the remaining forest.
Y eso se da también por un hecho fundamental, y es porque el momento en el que se firman ese tipo de compromisos, quien pasa a tomar decisiones y a gobernar esos territorios finalmente no son, en última instancia, las autoridades propias indígenas, digamos, sino pasa a ser el Estado, que es el que condiciona la entrega o no entrega de los incentivos económicos.
In the end, it's not the indigenous peoples that take the lead in developing each country, determining where these payments will go, but it's really the state that has the lead role and who can decide whether or not to give money to a certain community.
Que finalmente acaban siendo como un instrumento de chantaje para poder mantener, digamos, la continua entrega de este recurso económico.
And this is actually being used as a kind of blackmail to make sure that these kinds of lands are basically being taken over and the resistance is halted.
Yo ahí termino, gracias, y perdón que me tomé mucho tiempo. Gracias.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yvonne. Before giving floor to Jennifer, I would remind that there are lists where you can put your name, and email address, and then you will get presentations of Jennifer and Simone, and you may contact us if you want. So now, Jennifer, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm called Jennifer Major. I'm called Jennifer Major, coming from Uganda, from an organization called National Association of Professional Environmentalists. I'm really appreciating this opportunity of sharing with you a case study from Uganda on the impacts of monoculture tree plantations, financed as bioenergy plantations or REDD plantations, on women particularly and on their communities. Maybe briefly to explain to you what NAPE is, it is an NGO that works on a number of environmental issues with specific focus on advocacy and lobbying for sustainable use and management of natural resources, community empowerment, and human rights. Our major focus are on biodiversity and forestry, water governance, climate change, sound management of chemicals, energy, oil, food, gender, rivers and dams, wetlands, building community resilience. That's where we focus much more through Sustainability School and the community radio. The background of this study on the impacts of plantations on community is that the country, that is Uganda, it is a REDD participating country. So with support from World Bank, Uganda embarked on an idea of addressing climate change through REDD, thus promoting plantations to address the impacts of climate change. What did NAPE do? NAPE decided to do an assessment within the communities that were affected by this implementation. The communities are within about 3 districts or regions of Uganda, that is Wechabe in eastern Uganda along the shores of Lake Victoria, Butimba and Chihaja, that is in Hoima district. This is a district which has been affected by oil discovery, and also Mityana district, where the government is planning to construct a pipeline where oil will be transported. What are the findings? In the course of the assessment, it was discovered that industrial agriculture investments have destroyed agroecological farming through monocropping and large-scale deforestation, which are focusing mainly on profits and not on communities. If you look at those pictures, you can see the plantations that is in Lake Victoria, oil palm plantations, eucalyptus, and what is the effect? The natural forests have been destroyed to give way to these plantations. In the course of the implementation of the project, a number of impacts were experienced by communities. Of course, communities were displaced to give way for the plantations in their ancestral land, and they lost belonging, they lost their land. And if you do not have land, of course, you don't have food, and therefore leading to food insecurity. Communities are separated from their ancestral land, and thus they are vulnerable to land grabbing. And of course, the community as a society, their survival has actually been threatened, because you cannot now identify that a community was here or this community was there, because they were not resettled clearly. Out of this, it is the women who have been much more impacted on, because in our country, the cultural norm is that women are the custodians of their families and of seed and of food. So you see that the project impacted much more onto them. If we continue with the impacts, the women's farmers' capacity to produce food sustainably, there was no food, and thus no food security, in fact, no food sovereignty and no food security, and communities ended up being poor. They can no longer access their natural forests. Of course, these were ancestral homes. They can't get firewood for cooking. They used to get medicines from there and other resources which they could get from the forests. All these are completely gone because the forests have been destroyed for plantations. Women especially, because of these, still impacted on because they cannot access safe water, safe and clean water, and this increases much of their workload because they have to look for water from very, very far away and could be in places where they are not used to because they have left their natural homes and being displaced to the middle of nowhere. So out of this now, in the assessment, NAPE decided to do, after doing the assessment, it decided to make up some of the recommendations. What are the recommendations? The recommendations are to those in authority that emphasis on plantations as a solution to climate change should be stopped because forests, plantations they are actually a false solutions. They are not forests, and therefore they cannot do the activities which are supposed to be received through natural forests. Companies also that do these investments need to take up social responsibility and acting that they benefit the communities. They must make sure they compensate communities and especially women to reduce on their suffering. Because since they take care of the families, they take care of the children, if they are displaced to nowhere, they really suffer. The authorities also should ensure that communities with emphasis to women are resettled before eviction, because if you evict someone and you have not resettled him or compensated, where do you expect the person to be? And in case they are not resettled, then there should be an agreement for a coexistence. Allow communities to live within the areas where such projects are being implemented so that they can continue surviving. We also require that the government strengthens the moral building institutions. Those are the families which have for long been on the core of conservation of the environment. You can see that in most communities where forests have been conserved, it is because the indigenous people have lived there, they have lived within their means, within their environment, and they have conserved them. We should not emphasize the role of women in environmental conservation because they are the pillars of a family. Without a woman, there is no family. We also need to enforce or promote laws that protect communities and their environment, people's rights, women's rights, and livelihoods. So in the course of promoting these laws, it should be a bottom-up. Communities need to be involved in development processes, in development decisions, because they know exactly what they need, they know how they want to live, so they need to be consulted when they are developing laws, when they want to do any kind of project, a big investment. And this can reduce on their suffering, because at the end of the day, when forests are destroyed, women have nowhere to find firewood, they have to walk long distances, increasing their workload, and that's limiting their time of doing some productive work. And also communities need to be resettled properly, other than them living in a makeshift homes. You find the community in a very small hut. Some communities now, because they have nowhere to go, they can't start living in wetlands. And when situations of flooding happen, there's a lot of suffering within the communities. That being said, we really request that those who are in authority should see how to do things in the right way, to involve communities properly, making decisions by consulting communities right from the beginning or from a project inception, and this will enable the communities to live well. So we said that the situation of plantations on communities has not been as good as most governments think. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Jennifer. Now I will give a floor to Cynthia Wechabe from Indigenous Information Network from Kenya.
Thank you very much, sir. My name is Cynthia, as he has mentioned, and my presentation will focus on some of the positive examples that Indigenous Information Network has been working with communities back in Kenya to address, to adapt to climate change, and also to economically empower these groups in various ways. We know that the issues of marginalized indigenous community and marginalized communities, and in Kenya, these are communities who reside in dry areas, and the impact of climate change is impacted more on their livelihood. And therefore, we thought of what can we do to address this issue so that this indigenous community cannot purely depend on natural resources. Therefore, I'll share not all, some of the best practices that we have initiated within the community. And my colleague, not only my colleague, this is one of the beneficiaries within the women group that have benefited, and they're doing very well with their adaptation practices. As a project of climate change, we introduced best practices on land issues, restoration, and also on farming. And our main aim was to ensure that this community do not only depend on natural resources, but also see a way of economically empowering themselves as a community, and especially the women, and also making sure that their families are well, they are well adapting to these changes that are impacting their lives. Therefore, one of the best practices that we introduced was the capacity development. And we felt this is not enough because the information will continue being there, but we needed something that is sustainable. And we say, let us have on-farm demonstration. On-farm demonstration was done in various ways. One was on fodder management, which indirectly and directly can impact on land issues. And in this on-farm demonstration, we allow the different communities among the pastoralists to visit other residents who are doing very well, and to learn by seeing, not just by being taught in workshops and conferences. Then from there, we advise and encourage the communities also to do the same initiative. And for the women, we felt that since the women are the ones suffering more on these impacts of climate change, we introduced energy-saving jikos, and we call them the Kunimbili initiatives. These Kunimbili initiatives is one of the initiatives that is restoring the forest, because it uses very few sticks of the forest or the branches. And at the same time, the women were able to make some of the jikos, and they were selling to the entire country, and especially the residents within the communities. Through the selling, then the communities were able to get some money, which economically empowered them, and they were able also to take care of their families through taking them to schools and buying food. We introduced also traditional systems of storing water. That is water restoration, whereby these pots are able to infiltrate water without using chemicals, or rather maintaining their cleanness. So and also the same traditional hot pots, it helps the community to use less firewood, because they will not be able to boil for a long time. And this one also reduced the issues of disease spread by the impacts or the effects of climate change. Something else that we also introduced within the women group are the briquettes, where the women were going to use the waste papers. I think she will explain after my presentation. And the positive part of this is that these communities were able to not only to restore the forest, but also to conserve the environment, and also to make sure that the environment is clean in different ways. This also encouraged the schools, because some of the materials that they were using were getting from the schools, and also from around the environment that they are living. Another best practice that we've been doing within the community members among the indigenous groups is the protection of the water sources. And we do this by, first of all, getting information from the communities who depend purely on a certain source of water. And maybe this same water is being utilized by livestock, at the same time the residents. And this is not really health-wise, because there was issues of the spread of diseases between the animals and the community themselves. There was competition between the livestock and the residents. There was so much about the issue surrounding the issues, and the issue of the water. They use surrounding the sharing of the water sources. Therefore, what we do is to separate this water and to separate the water of the community and the livestock. And this one brought even peace, and it also helped in avoiding conflict between boundaries. Something else that has also helped in promoting adaptation among the indigenous communities is the introduction of alternative livelihood. Most of the communities that we have been working with are pastoralists, and they purely depend on livestock. And remember, keeping of large cattle, they directly impact on land. And we are trying to address the issues of land other than the direct impact from climate change. And therefore, we introduced what we call, we introduced the greenhouse, the planting of crops in greenhouses. And most women group adopted this practice, and it has really helped them in addressing issues of food security and also destocking some of the livestock they have. This opportunity I will give to my colleague, who is one of the beneficiaries of the community, to tell us how they have directly benefited from the initiatives.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. Thank you very much. I am Naya, as you have been told. I come from Kenya, and I am happy to be with you here because of information collection. I am one of the beneficiaries of Indigenous Information Network. On the ground, I work with the women groups, 22 user groups of women groups, and we have actually been affected by climate change. During the past days, we did not know that what was happening, because in the older days we were planting crops, harvesting, selling, getting money, but for some time we realized that we are planting and there is nothing we are getting in our gardens. So we had to receive education from Indigenous Information Network, of which it was very important to most of the women. They had to know what climate change is and adapt in different things. They had to first know that water was something which was very dangerous to them, because they had to go far away to get that water, and that water also is very dirty because the forests have been distracted. So we had to do what we call water harvesting. Each woman was to dig and generate and harvest the rainwater during the rainy season. With that water, we had to do what we call agroforestry. We had to plant short season crops for domestic use only. This climate change actually has brought a lot of seriousness, especially to women, because most of them have divorced, most of the children have dropped from schools, and poverty from most of the houses. So as we received this education and harvest water, it has helped us to get income, to buy food, and to do away with poverty. Also, we had to know about energy, improve the traditional energy chicos. We had to make, and it helped because the women could not again go to the forests and cut trees, but instead, due to the harvested water, they make their tree nurseries and plant on riverbanks. They plant in schools and in their homes. With these 22 user groups, every woman had to actually plant about 100 seedlings, and the rest were planted in schools, and they affected the Mau forest, the affected area, which were the main source of the water for our place. I think our challenges, if we could actually get enough funds, we could prosper. And you know, when women are being empowered, everything will be okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nayan. And now I will pass the floor to Simone Oliveira, Executive Director of the Global Forest Coalition from Paraguay.
Okay, thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be on such a panel with people with real underground experience with these issues. So yeah, I would like to sort of end with putting some links between the different presentations. I mean, what we've really heard is, you know, some very inspiring examples in Ecuador, in Kenya, of how women often take the lead in developing very sustainable projects that contribute to livelihoods, first and foremost, but also to climate resilience and mitigation. This is what you classically call the non-market-based approaches. You know, it's very holistic approaches. It's not about carbon accounting because, you know, as you also heard, it contributes to so much more than just carbon. It's also hydrological cycles that are at stake, you know, fertilization of soils. I mean, how can you count for that? How can you calculate that? Next slide. But what we see is that if you look at where the climate finance for land use projects, forest and other land use projects is really going, only a very small percentage is really going to these kinds of holistic projects. So we started to do a bit of analysis with my colleague Coraina, who's also here and has done a lot of the background research for this, on the different climate finance streams for forests and other land use projects, and to really analyze, okay, so where is this going and why is this, you know, not going to the right places? Next. Yes. So the biggest of all is actually the Forest Investment Program, which is one of the climate investment funds of the World Bank. This one aims to provide direct investments to developing countries to support development of REDD plus projects and objectives. There are currently already, at least in the beginning of this year, there were 23 FIP countries, of which 14 had already been approved as pilot countries, and 9 were elaborating their investment plans. They do have, which is positive, a dedicated grant mechanism for indigenous peoples and local communities. They also have a private sector set-aside program, PSSA. But regretfully, this whole program faces several problems. One very big problem is that the actual money, that while $775 million has been pledged originally, and $555 had already been endorsed, so received, only $36 million has actually been disbursed to countries and indigenous peoples and corporations until now. But the bigger problem that we actually see with the FIP funding is that it mainly provides loans instead of grants. And it very much supports so-called blended finance, which means actually, to say it simply, that public funds are being used to attract much larger investment by the private sector. Now, this sounds very positive. And if you actually see the formal climate finance proposals that are made in this conference, a lot of what the donors are presenting is actually this kind of blended finance. They will only provide a little bit of money, very often old and existing money, instead of new and additional funding. And even that money is then used to trigger bigger private finance, private sector investments. However, in the field of land use and forest, it is highly complicated, because the kind of project that Cynthia and Beth just described are extremely important for people's livelihoods. But in terms of commercial profitability, they just don't score that well. A monoculture tree plantation, also in Kenya, is still a lot more profitable than a small-scale, community-led, women's-led project on the ground. And that's just the logic of economics, which needs economies of scale, which means large-scale projects, which needs, you know, professional marketing. So you just see that constantly, that the real good things, you know, by smallholders are left out. The other big complication is actually the carbon accounting. You know, for this kind of investments, you need to exactly count how much carbon, you know, is being sequestered by your project. You can imagine that a complicated project, as was just described, is just impossible to count all of that. So what you see then in practice is that there's more and more tendency of a forest investment program to actually not invest in forests, but to invest in monoculture tree plantations. And the hopeless thing is that monoculture tree plantations have very little to do with forests, except for the fact that both have trees. They do not contain any biodiversity, except for one species normally. They tend to have between 10 and 50% stored between 10 and 50% of the carbon. By definition, they're very impermanent because they're typically planted to be cut again, or to be exhausted, as they call it in some of these corridors. And they have actually been recognized now increasingly as a key driver of deforestation. It is recognized that the expansion of monoculture tree plantations, especially of palm oil, is actually a very important driver also of deforestation. And that's even in the investment plans that countries have submitted to the FIP, that is acknowledged. But at the same time, fascinating, these investment plans still promote further expansion of tree plantations. And, you know, I here mentioned two examples in Ghana, which states that as part of its investment plans, you know, it's also exploring crops and trees and biofuels such as oil palm and jatropha, and trees like rubber, so-called to reduce carbon footprints. And Indonesia is, you know, pretending to meet increasing wood volumes by inter alia plantation projects. Next. A similar inclusion of the promotion of tree plantation can, for example, be found in UN-REDD and the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility. UN-REDD from the UN, FAO, UNEP, and UNDP have set up that REDD Plus fund. And the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility is actually to make countries ready for REDD, as they call it. So the countries have submitted a lot of projects and plans there for REDD Plus there. And there again, you see a lot of monoculture tree plantations being proposed. In Brazil, for example, a very big monoculture tree plantation of 65,000 project that is run by logging and pulp companies. I don't think they really have plans to keep the trees standing. Uganda was just mentioned, the Kikanda carbon tree plantations, 8,000 hectares of pine plantations. You here see a tree plantation from Uganda also. Burkina Faso is proposing different types of plantations, commercial reforestation plantations, you know, and really also to attract private sector investments. And Indonesia is also proposing the establishment of additional fast-growing pulp and timber plantations on lands as an alternative source of timber. And the fascinating thing is that a lot of these plantations, as you can see, are actually promoted with the potential, yes, but there's so much demand for wood and paper that we need these additional plantations, because if not, we cannot meet that demand. So the logical response would be, so maybe we should look at the demand, and are there not ways to reduce the demand? I mean, one of the few very nice things of this UNFCCC is, you know, this paper poor initiative that we are all now trying to save paper wherever we can. Yet, if you go to a Forest Action Day, like yesterday, you see several people around the table claiming that wood is such a sustainable product and that we can actually save the forest by consuming more of it. And I still don't see that logic. I mean, a tree stands in a forest, or you cut it down and you use it. But there's some contradiction between cutting trees to conserve them. I still don't really get that around. And of course, it's a typical private sector logic that this will lead to more investment in the forest for sustainable forest management. But the more you extract from the forest, the less sustainable it becomes, because the sustainability of forest management is very much quantity related. The more wood you extract, the less sustainable it becomes. So there is a big contradiction between that thing. Lastly, the Global Environment Facility, actually last but not least, because it was actually the first financial mechanism of the UNFCCC, and it's too often forgotten in the REDD Plus discussion that since 1991, I mean, donors have been funding forest conservation in the name of climate change. Thank you very much. And some of the nice things there are that it also funds, you know, forests from a climate biodiversity and sustainable forest management perspective. There's a very nice small grants program that provides public support directly to conservation initiatives by indigenous peoples, local communities, and women. However, if you look at the amount it is, has now been stabilized after a couple of years growth, sadly, even though everybody is enthusiastic about its success. And for this period, it's only 140 million of 3.8 billion US dollar. And another very worrying development in GF is that there are more and more financing market-based and private sector-driven approaches. They are currently experimenting with 2 pilot programs. One is on non-grants instruments, which is actually including investments in companies like coffee companies under the pretension that the coffee produced is shade grown, so it's relatively better than other coffee. But if you look at it, it actually boils down to a pure commercial investment insofar that GF expects the money to be returned after a certain number of years. So that means that that money only will be returned if the coffee business is growing, if it is going well, because that's what the terms of a normal investments are. So basically, the GF has now invested in the expansion of coffee business. You know, that's good news for those who like coffee here and know that with every zip you support the GF. But of course, there's some contradiction with the limits to growth agenda. The other example of an integrated approach is, for example, a very large deforestation-free commodities project, which is also in Paraguay. These are some photos from my home country, including deforestation-free soy. Now, one of the big problems there is that they're clearly working with the big corporations only. Here again, there's no limits to growth agenda. There's no limits to demand. There's no limits to, for example, meat and dairy consumption, which would be 2 key issues we should talk about if we really want to reduce deforestation and carbon emissions. But this agenda is very much driven towards more growth, but then in deforestation-free ways, so in zones that do not have forests anymore. Now, that's easy to find in a country like Paraguay, where, for example, the forests in the east have already been reduced to 8%. But we would very much actually like to restore those forests again, because it used to be about 80% of our country, 70% of our country that had forests. So we need to restore them if we really want to do something about climate change. And the other sad thing is that now there's a lot of small farmers living on those lands. And they still suffer by massive agrotoxic contamination, which is inherent to genetically modified soy production, and also land grabbing, because of the soy now moving more and more into existing deforested lands away from the forest. So you're basically not solving, you know, most of the problems. So to finalize, there's been a lot of talk about dialogue with private sector. Of course, dialogue is always good, and we also support absolutely those corporations that want to improve their production processes. But it should be realized that a corporation, as an entity of a capitalist system, can never accept limits to its growth. It just cannot sell that to its shareholders. You know, the shareholders invest in a corporation in the promise of returns. That means the corporation has to expand its business. There's no other way. It cannot accept any proposal by governments that would limit the growth of its industry. And that's a very serious problem, because we happen to live on a planet that has boundaries. And we happen to deal with an agenda here that means a massive reduction, transformative change, you know, serious limits to growth and reductions if we really want to come to 1.5 degrees, which is actually already quite a risky target. I mean, don't think that we're there if we have 1.5. So there's just no way that we can still encompass limits to growth. And, you know, you then see, for example, on the field of agriculture, you know, this public-private partnerships, like the Global Alliance to Climate Smart Agriculture, that are finding all kinds of ways to sort of green up agriculture, but they're not talking about limits to growth. The other very big issue on this, and I'm glad that they started talking about this now in this climate convention, is conflicts of interest. And this is, you know, a very tough term for something that's actually very subtle. You know, if you have a joint project with an industry, there is a natural incentive to ensure that the solution, the policies you develop as part of that industry, do not hurt the commercial interests of your partners. And that means that the commercial interests of the corporate partners in such a joint partnership will determine the agenda. And that means that, for example, limits to growth will no longer be on the table. It also means that, for example, the United Nations, which is working more and more together with corporate, will subtly have an incentive, a financial dependency on the private sector, meaning that the corporate interests of its partners will determine its agendas. And whether that's Coca-Cola in projects of, UN Women, which then suddenly do not talk about the risks of sugar-sweetened beverages anymore, or, there's loads of examples like that. And there's actually only one organization that has really understood it. That's the World Health Organization, that has pointed out that it's not so subtle to work with the tobacco industry. We're talking about the health impacts of tobacco. It's the only UN organization that has until now realized that, really working with the wolves means that there's some risk to your agenda. Last. And then, of course, there's the biggest risk of actually the corporate takeover of the agenda, but Alberto started with, and I just wanted to end of this again, because what has been proposed by ICAO is too scandalous to be true. And yesterday night, I attended one of their side events. I mean, this is the most rapidly expanding source of emissions in the world. And they're not even pretending to really reduce it. They just talk about carbon neutral growth, pretending that these very vulnerable tree plantations that we just showed, which are planted to be cut, they're per definition non-permanent, that they would be enough to offset their emissions. Now, this makes the entire climate convention, everything we do, renderless. If we step into these kinds of offsetting proposals. And the scary thing is that while they're outside the convention, so formally their market-based mechanism is outside the convention, as Alberto pointed out, they are now going to try to influence the European Union so that it can become part of the emissions trading scheme. And because they are likely to accept forced carbon offset, they'll try to convince the European Union to do that as well. That will not only completely destroy the emissions trading scheme, because there will be too much offer of carbon credits and too little demand, but it will also mean that the big serious arguments there were not to include forest and carbon offset schemes because of these problems of permanence, because of all kinds of problems with accounting, reference levels, baselines, and REDD Plus has not solved those problems, will all be washed off the table just for the commercial industry interests of the aviation industry. We very much hope this will not happen. For that reason, after the side event, we actually wanted to invite you to an action that is being organized by a lot of colleagues from climate justice activists, from the climate justice movement, youth organizations, Sustain US, and women's groups. It will take place in the restaurant zone at 4:45. So I will stop now, because I very much hope that after this side event, a lot of people will join us for this action that will demonstrate why forests are not a very good way to offset the emissions from an industry like aviation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simone. I would like to thank all panelists because we have 20 minutes for questions and answers. And also, I would remind you that if you don't put your name and email address to the list, please do it, and we shall send you these presentations. And also, if you registered here on this token, you can come to our booth 12D, and you can get many presentations from Global Forest Coalition, many our publications, not to bring lots of paper, but get electronic versions. And also you can come to our website, globalforestcoalition.org, and also get presentations. Now I will ask, yes, Simone, please.
Y solo para decir, si las hermanas de Ecuador o otra gente quieren preguntar cosas en español, yo puedo traducirles.
Yeah, thank you. And now I would ask questions. First, say your name and organization, and then ask question, please. Yes, please.
¿Quieres venir a frente? ¿Quieres venir para que te escuche bien?
Alicia, que vengas para que te escuchen mejor.
You may speak there.
Buenas tardes, Waponi Gaurique. Mi nombre es Huella y mi nombre propio Guarani, español, soy Alicia Cabulla.
Good afternoon, my name is Wei in Guarani.
Soy de Ecuador, mi selva es Yasuní y soy pueblo Guarani.
I'm from Ecuador, from the Guarani people, and my forest is called Yasuni.
Nosotros en el Ecuador tenemos un territorio en la Amazonía, Napo, Pastaza, Orellana. En este territorio, lo que es Pastaza, han firmado sin consultar a las comunidades sociobosque. Entonces, este territorio, a nosotros, el gobierno, el Ministerio de Ambiente, hicieron sin consultar, después complicaron el territorio porque ahí dice no corte árbol, no pesque y tienen que prohibir para poder dar comida de alimentos que tenemos como carne, pesca. Entonces antes éramos libres de nuestro territorio. Por eso nosotros como preocupación de nosotros hemos dicho, las mujeres somos únicas que cuidamos, compartimos en esta selva con medicinas, nuestra educación, nuestra salud desde nuestra selva. Ya no queremos que los gobiernos o los países que están dando dinero.
So she's telling that in the forest where she lives, the government has actually established 5 big social bosque programs. So they're paying people, but they're now prohibiting them to use the forest, to fish, to cut the trees. And she just points out that, you know, they've always lived in harmony with their forest, and especially the women have always used the traditional medicine. They very much depend on the fish for their proteins.
Y este territorio nos están prohibiendo, los ministerios de ambiente dicen que prohibido sacar, prohibido cortar árboles, pero antes, sin convenio, nosotros vivíamos mejor, porque este territorio es ancestral de nosotros, de los abuelos que ellos vivían, pero ahora este ministerio nos prohíbe, y asimismo el ministerio dice, prohibido, prohibido sacar pesca, carne, árbol. Pero cuando el gobierno quiere sacar el petróleo de este territorio, no nos importa a los indígenas o los dueños de esta selva. El gobierno manda a sacar el petróleo y ahí tenemos problema en nuestra vida.
So these 5 projects were basically established without any consultation with indigenous peoples, who are now confronted with a lot of prohibitions. They cannot cut trees anymore for their own use. They cannot fish anymore. They cannot hunt anymore. And this is why, at the same time, they very much reject these projects because this is their ancestral territories. They're now living a lot worse. They've always cared for this project. And at the same time, they're seeing that the government is not prohibiting all exploration in the very, very same area.
Por eso, este territorio, nuestros abuelos, esta selva que teníamos, no necesitamos de dólar o centavo. Nuestro territorio es importante, que esta selva es como un mercado que tenemos, donde podamos coger y comer, compartir con medicinas ancestrales que tenemos con los chamanes, con los curanderos. Tenemos esta selva, pero cuando ya entra esas empresas como Sociobosque, nos dicen que no tienen que hacer, pero siendo a los dueños, a nosotros de este territorio, nos prohíben. Y por eso nosotros como pueblo o como comunidad que somos mujeres, ya no queremos trabajar con esta red, porque nos afecta a nosotros, porque nosotros sin red es mejor vivir como queremos nuestros pueblos. Y también porque ahora dice que ¿dónde estamos viendo para que nuestra selva es grande en Yasuní?
So we don't need the money, she says. I mean, the forest is like a market for us. We were always living fine from the forest, which is the forest, the territory of our ancestors. And that's why we're now rejecting this social bosques project, and we're rejecting REDD+, because we really feel that, you know, we were much better off earlier.
Porque nosotros en esta selva queremos que nuestros hijos vivan lo que queremos en el futuro, que vivan sano y limpio como nuestros abuelos. Por eso las luchas de las mujeres queremos que el petróleo o la minería, que quede todas las mujeres, no estamos solo uno, porque en la Amazonía somos diferentes nacionalidades y pueblos que vivimos, como en la sierra, ellos conservan su río, nosotros también la selva, pero es las voces de las mujeres que decimos que el petróleo o la mina o el agua tienen que quedar para futuras generaciones, porque nosotros no queremos que maten toda esa selva, ni minera, ni petrolera.
So that is why we really, feel that this should be our territories, our rights should be respected, and this is about our livelihoods really, and we don't want this REDD Plus project, and we also, all the women in the forest, because we're many different peoples, we reject the oil exploration and the mining, because this really forms a major threat to our children.
Esto, y también quiero decir, porque Sociobosque dice conservación, no es conservación, es más bien los químicos, todo ríos cuando fumigan también en las pistas, en los sembríos de yuca, eso ha afectado a nosotros, por eso no queremos más trabajar con la red o con Sociobosque.
So that is why we don't want to work anymore with REDD Plus and Sociobosque, because what we see is that, they ignore the big problems like the contamination of the rivers by all the chemicals, by the agro-industry, by the oil industry, and they only basically try to address the kind of activities that were already contributing to conservation in the past.
Yo soy de la selva de Yasuní, pero a mí afecta las petroleras. No tengo agua limpia, ya vivo río contaminado. La vida de chamanes está en peligro. La vida de los pueblos no tatarmenani está en peligro. Por eso ha sido la voz de pasar. Gracias, nada más. Mi nombre es Huella. Yo soy de Ecuador.
Okay, so Waze is saying that at this moment there's actually a massive threat because the waterways are very much polluted. She doesn't have clean drinking water anymore. Her community is very much affected, and a lot of people, including the shaman, are getting ill because of the pollution, contamination of the water by the oil companies.
Thank you very much for this valuable comment. And who has questions? Please, you have possibility now. Yes, please. Come here and yes, please.
Can people?
Oh, pass. Can you pass? Where is?
Hola, era más un comentario. ¿Tú me puedes ayudar?
Okay, it was just a comment.
Yes. Hemos visto en tu presentación los diferentes fondos, FIP, FCPF, ONU-REDD.
We've seen the different funds in your presentation, like PIP and...
Y lo que suele pasar es que muchos de los países en América Latina o países que queremos acceder al financiamiento, nuestros gobiernos, se meten a estos fondos.
¿Se meten?
Entran a estos fondos.
But we see in our countries is very often if our governments need money, these kinds of funds are using, yeah? Are entering.
Pero realmente no saben cómo van a trabajar esos fondos. Y siempre hay problemas de consulta con pueblos indígenas, de poca transparencia, de poca consulta con diferentes actores, y quedan muchos de estos fondos en grupos cerrados.
And what you see in practice is that there's very little knowledge on how these funds really work. And as a result, there often is not enough consultation with indigenous peoples. There's very little transparency, and it's very hard for the governments also to work with them, also because they tend to work in clusters. There's very close collaborations between the different funds.
Y por otro lado, tienes a la banca multilateral, Banco Mundial, BID, que te dice, tenemos salvaguardas y eso te va a ayudar. Y realmente las salvaguardas no están ayudando en los diferentes países. Yo soy de Perú. Debí presentarme primero. Mi nombre es Cecilia Tacusi. Yo trabajo en Proética, que es el capítulo peruano de Transparencia Internacional.
So what we very much see is that all these funds, they're just saying, well, we have safeguards. And also the Inter-American Development Bank And the World Bank is saying, oh, but this will all be okay because we have the safeguards. But what you really see on the ground is that these safeguards are not working. And for example, she's from Peru. She's from Transparency International in Peru. And you really see that on the ground, these safeguards are not well implemented.
Entonces, a la final, muchas de las salvaguardas quedan en la voluntad política. Y la voluntad política generalmente en nuestros países se asocia mucho a lo que es los temas de corrupción y falta de transparencia y poco involucramiento de actores.
And the essence of most of the safeguards is that their implementation is very much dependent on political will. And what we see in Latin America is that a lot of governments lack the political will for serious implementation. So as a result, there's very little transparency and there's very little actual implementation.
Okay. Era más un comentario.
Yeah. Yeah. Ghanshyam, please. Can you pass the microphone to him? Thank you very much. No, okay.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to all the panelists for your very comprehensive presentation on what you are doing. So I think you may know about the Nepal situation, and we are also doing struggle with this CIF and this forest investment program. They are also proposing the same way of the concessional loan, which is about 75% and 25% as a grant. And then they are also pushing the local communities and indigenous peoples, showing there is the DGM they can use and mobilize. But on the other hand, there is a great risk of losing the opportunity as well as the rights secure in the REDD+ strategy. So there is a big dilemma between this FIP grant and DGM. So that's the I want to share from Nepal, and basically indigenous peoples and local communities are doing struggle, not loan in addressing the climate change problem. So no rights, no REDD, and no loan. These are the themes that we are doing in the country Nepal. So as I hear from other countries, they are also fighting for their rights, secure in the REDD or climate policy. So may I ask Simone and maybe the Global Forest Coalition can lead an initiative or solidarity or partnership to look around the monitor what is happening through the FIP. So where the rights are going to curtail, where rights are not recognized. So these are the most important thing. And I just learning from Nepal, when government has given the authority to protect and manage the forest to the local communities, there has been big change has seen in around the countries. But after that change, now government is trying to show that forest and get loan and put that loan money in other sector such as hydro or other infrastructure project, which is that can create the big conflict and also cause the again deforestation. So I think maybe we can create some kind of the global solidarity for looking, monitoring, and of course GFC can lead. And I'm Ghanshyam Pandey. I'm from Nepal. I'm advisor of FECOFUN and also the coordinator for Global Alliance of Community Forestry. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And I will ask Simone to answer this valuable question.
Yeah, with great pleasure. We would like to help communities on the ground on this. We actually, my colleague, Coraina, is the Northern Observer and Civil Society Observer to the Forest Investment Program. What she's been trying to do until now, and people who are interested are very welcome to approach me, and I can gather your address and put you on the list, is she's trying to send information about FIP projects to as broad a community as possible, especially, of course, the groups we know in the relevant country, so that people are aware that their governments are working on these projects and so that they can get in contact and try to get involved. They can also always send back comments to Coraina, who will then, forward them to the World Bank. So we've already had a couple of times that we've had very valuable feedback from the countries, from groups in the country. Civil society organizations can also be governments. Sometimes there's government officials that, as our colleague from Peru said, that are just not aware of their colleagues from another department negotiating a certain FIP project. So, if you have input, feedback, please send it to us. And just then, of course, the struggle is always to get them to have them taken seriously by the FIP. I must say, it has been quite an uphill struggle in the FIP. It's formally very open to observers, but your commands are seldom really taken seriously. And even then, I think, but actually, I wanted to react on what our colleague from Peru said about the clustering of these organizations, because that's indeed fascinating. Of course, 4 of these funds are World Bank administrated. GF, FIP, and FCPF, 3 of those funds. UN-REDD is now very much aligned with FCPF, so that's also very much working together. And they have very close links with regional development banks. And you just see during the FIP meetings, and I've once attended in Coraina's place, you just see how much, this is basically the real deals are not made around the table, but in the corridors. And that's where the agreements are made, which countries are going to be funded and which not. And often even against the formal proposals of their own independent review panel. So they have a formal panel of experts reviewing their plans and proposals, and they make certain recommendations, and even those are pushed aside because the real decisions are made in the corridor. And I'll never forget how, at a certain moment, we had this very controversial project in Democratic Republic of Congo, which was literally proposing to plant a very large oil palm plantation as REDD+. So nowadays we are planting oil palm plantations as a form to reduce emissions from deforestation. And even the independent review panel had advised against that project, pointing out, well, that's not really a forest. And, we literally heard from the World Bank, well, we do not see any issue of, oil palm being planted as part of REDD+. And all the banks just closed ranks and said, no, but that's fine. That should be possible. So that is actually a real problem. And I know for countries, it's a real problem as well, because they have these different banks they have to negotiate with. So for a government representative, this is often a hard game as well. And especially the loans issue, I think you mentioned, is key there. Because it forces them to pay back, to get indebted. And to make sure that whatever they do in forest is profitable, instead of just conserving forest, because a forest is an important ecosystem. Thank you very much. So I think it's a very important issue that you mentioned. But please come up to us if you want to be part of this network and want to be kept involved.
Thank you. Now already 4 o'clock and 4:30, and it's time to other panel to have their side event here. So on this note, I would like to remind anybody that in 15 minutes near restaurants there would be action, and I invite everybody there. And I would like you join me in applauding to our panelists. Thank you very much.
Si gustan, podemos entregarles un tríptico de las mujeres. Allá tienen, gracias. In English, yes. No, circular. ¿Quieres circular? Sí, por favor. Sí.